There is an old warning in rural Ireland that says, if you go for a walk, be sure to carry some stones in your pocket, and if you begin to feel that you are lost, throw the stones ahead on your path to ensure that if you are afflicted by the fairy stray, you will not walk into a lake or a river or step off a cliff. G'day, I'm Kitty. Welcome to Fairy Encounters. This week's video is a little shorter than usual. I've had a few bumps in the road over the past weeks. Our beloved wolfhound passed away quite suddenly, and I've been a little unwell too, so I'm working on a full-length video, but it's not quite ready. So I have a bit of a shorter video this week just to quench your curious minds. Well, I've been feeling a little lost myself lately, so it seems apt to share some true experiences with the fairy stray. Have you heard of the stray? If you are afflicted by the stray, you are not simply lost. You are hopelessly, endlessly lost. Your mind is fairy struck into seeing something which isn't there. Imagine you are out for a lovely walk. The sun is shining, the birds are singing. Ahead of you, in the distance, is a deep, boggy lake, but in your eyes, it appears a lush and inviting green field. Imagine what happens next. You confidently stride right into that green field and drown. Or the fairy stray can strike in a different way. You might find yourself walking the same route over and again, unable to break the cycle, until at last you collapse from exhaustion. Take a look at these two recent experiences with the stray from viewers of the channel. The first comes from Canada and the second from Ireland. I hope you'll enjoy them. I've gone tree planting the last 2 summers, which here in Canada is a classic but incredibly grueling student job. We often work alone in the woods, far removed from civilization. Everyone lives in work camps out in the middle of nowhere while planting, usually for about 3 months in total. Basically, our camp was in a gravel pit off a logging road surrounded by the northern Canadian boreal forest. It consisted of one large main area with a few gravel mounds and a path of about 200 metres that led to a grassy open area which was surrounded by forest. The kitchen trailer, the shower trailer, the fleet of trucks and most of the other planters' tents were in the large open area with the gravel mounds. But me and my boyfriend and 3 of our other friends had our tents back at the little grassy clearing beyond the main area. We chose that area because we thought it would be quieter, but it turned out to be very strange. My boyfriend and I had our tent up against the forest and at night would hear voices coming from the woods. The voices were distinctly human. They were laughing and sometimes yelling or in boisterous discussion, and we assumed that it was coming from the main camp area. Whenever it happened, we would ask our friends who stayed in the main camp what all the ruckus had been about. They would invariably tell us that it had been totally quiet in main camp, everyone so exhausted that they just slept. We would hear music too. It was usually a strange beat or melody emanating from the woods that none of the people in the main camp would report hearing. So we were there replanting part of a forest that had been destroyed in a forest fire. The block we worked consisted of pieces of burnt forest rimmed with small areas of unscathed trees along a long ATV trail. I was working at the very end of the ATV trail, around 1.5 kilometres from where our work trucks were parked and where we would meet up at the end of the day to drive back to our camp. At the end of one of these days, I got extremely disoriented when trying to get back on the trail to walk back to the trucks. I had walked around the end of the trail to the piece of forest across the trail from mine and couldn't remember how to get out. Everything looked completely different. As time passed, I became more and more confused and lost, trying to find my way back, and eventually I started yelling to my friends to come and help me. Well, they were all at the trucks by this point, about 1.5 kilometres away, so of course none of them could hear my screaming. Then all of a sudden, I heard my friend's voice coming from the burnt-out forest. It was a vast expanse of burnt trees, all of which looked the same, going on for miles and miles. I yelled out his name, but immediately got a viscerally uncomfortable feeling about it. I stood for a moment among the burnt-out trees, and I just knew something was seriously wrong. I could feel it. I felt fear in the pit of my stomach. I turned and began walking fast in the opposite direction and eventually popped out on the trail. I ran as fast as I could toward the trucks and never looking back, and I told everyone what had happened. Everyone was rattled by it. I wasn't the only one who felt a strange sort of power in those forests. Even today, I still get the heebie-jeebies remembering that afternoon. That camp had extremely creepy vibes. Strange things happen out there. We found out just recently that the indigenous tribes of that area have their own stories about vengeful witches and other spirits of that land who live in the woods and forests there. This happened in around 1991 or 92, near Bantry in Cork. This German man came over to Cork to recover from something or another. It was some sort of upset anyway he was trying to recuperate from. Why he chose Cork, I do not know, but he did. He was young, I'd say. I'd put him in his early 20s, much the same as me at the time. So he rented the little cottage down the way from my farm, some ways outside of Bantry town. I saw him most days, taking walks, and we would pass the time. You know how it is. He was friendly enough, a little standoffish, but it didn't bother me at all. He wasn't interested in taking in the tourist sites or anything like that, and he wasn't a drinking man, not least in town, but who knows what people do behind closed doors, and it's not for me to say. Well, he must have been here in the valley just a few weeks. I'd see him walking 2 or 3 times a day when I was out in my fields or even from the kitchen window. Then this one day, I see him rushing toward my house like a mad thing, and it must have been around dusk then. Something had a hold of him. He looked dishevelled, like he'd rolled down a long hill or something. His eyes were wide. He had scratches to his face and hands, and he was wet from the waist down. He came right up to me, up in my face, and started talking this gibberish. He kept grasping at my arms too and insisted that I stay with him. So I sat him down and I got him speaking English, and he said he had been out since morning walking. Walking and walking, he said. On the walk he did every day, but he couldn't stop and he couldn't find his way back. He was just walking around the same woodland path, through the creek, around a set of trees on that side of the creek. Then he'd find himself back at the creek. He'd walk through it to get to the other side, then around the same woodland path and back to the creek. He was lost, he said, and every time he thought he figured the way out, he found himself back at the creek. And he felt something telling him that his house was on the other side of the creek. So he crossed it, and so it went over and over again. Every time he crossed the creek, he heard what he believed to be voices, but they were unclear. He thought there must be tourists nearby speaking a different language, but he could see no one. Just whispering and sometimes muffled laughter. The man was in torment and exhausted by the sight of him, and no wonder he'd been walking for hours and hours, so he said. Well, I gave it some thought and I asked him, "Did you go down near the old stone circle at all?" And he answered, yes, he did. He took a walk among them that morning. And I told him, I said, "You don't want to be going near those old stones. You're after upsetting the Fae folk there." Well, of course, he had no idea of the other crowd, so I explained to him all I thought he need knowing and no more. Sure, the fellow was scared enough as it was. "They've only put the stray on you," I said. "I've seen it plenty of times, happen to myself once or twice. They play tricks with your mind, get you lost and keep you lost. You can count yourself lucky they didn't drown you in that creek." Well, his face fell deathly pale. He nodded and said he had heard of such things at home in Germany. But, he said, "I didn't hear them at the stones. I heard voices repeatedly at the creek, only at the creek," he said. "'Tis right," I told him. "That's where they wanted you, at the creek. They've given you a good old run around, I'd say." Well, the German fella insisted that I walk with him back to his little house. He packed his bags and left right then. I walked with him to the road to Bantry and stood waiting with him until a car pulled up and gave him a ride. Never saw that German again. Poor fella, got such a fright, but it's true, you know, what I said. He was lucky to get away with only a dose of the stray. It could have been worse, much worse. I can't help feeling a little sorry for that German man. He chose a quiet valley in beautiful County Cork to recover from some personal trauma, and then inadvertently offended the fairy and ended up fleeing Ireland in the middle of the night. What could cause a fairy to put such a curse on a person who is just out for a walk? Barry was convinced it was because the German had gone near the old stones. I wonder if he could be referring to the Kiel standing stone and stone circle a ways north of Bantry. It is possible the German damaged the stone somehow, or took something from the sacred site which angered the fairy. It's not surprising that fairies should act to protect the natural world. Is it a stretch then to believe that they also defend ancient sites against a threat, perceived or real? Maybe the German didn't do anything wrong. Perhaps there was just something about him that they disliked. Or they simply felt like having some fun at a human's expense, and he was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Striking a person with the stray is not in itself deadly. It is what the person could do in their confusion which can prove fatal. Luckily, on this occasion, the German found Barry and broke free from the stray. I guess we'll never know why the fairy targeted this German man, but one thing we know for certain: next time you're in Ireland, be sure to tread lightly. Be respectful to her land, her creatures, and of course, her sacred sites. Or you too might be fairy struck with the stray. I hope you enjoyed this video. Go on and show me some love. It costs nothing but some good vibes. All you need to do is subscribe to the channel, ding the notifications bell, and don't forget to click that thumbs up. It shows YouTube that you're enjoying my videos, and it means a lot to me. I have a fabulous video coming up for you next week, so keep an eye out for that one. Sending love to my members and patrons. Your support means the world to me. You have no idea how much. Until next time, stay curious. Cheerio.